We are still waiting for more to come in, but anyhow, I think we should get the webinar going. So a warm welcome to all of you here today to this webinar on poverty, human rights, and the SDGs. The webinar is based on a book that Martha Davies, Amanda Lyons, and myself just had co-edited, and which just came out starting some 3 years ago. When we started out some 3 years ago, we could not have foreseen that the book would be fresh out of the printer at a time where the world is faced with a poverty situation that has been severely aggravated due to the past 15 months with the COVID-19 crisis. Years of work eradicating extreme poverty has been brushed away at all continents. This will be the agenda item number 1 on the global agenda, and it will be the responsibility of the global community to address it in the coming years. And we already see it unfolding in discussions on a new social contract, new global deal, build back better, build forward fairer. Whatever the rhetorical frame will be on this gigantic task for the international community, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the human rights instruments that we have at hand, will be at the core of the challenge. At this webinar, we will focus on the intersection between poverty, human rights, and the SDGs. The webinar will be co-moderated by Amanda Lyons and myself. And we have 4 outstanding panelists to join us shortly. Amanda will present them in a moment. After the panel, we will have time for discussion, and we look very much forward to interesting comments and questions and to a lively discussion. Please use the chat, and then we will try to keep an eye on the questions and convey them to the panelists. The webinar will also be recorded, so we can share it afterwards for those who could not be here today. We will share it on our website, on the RWI website, and I'm sure that Martha's and Amanda's institutes will also share them on their website. Before we turn to the panel, I would like to give the floor to Professor Martha Davies to introduce the book. It is very much the initiative of Martha. Thank you very much for pushing us back there some 3 years ago. Very good initiative. Please, Martha.
Thank you, Morten. Well, it was definitely a team effort, not only among the editors, the co-editors, but also among the many contributors. And so as Morten said, the occasion for this webinar is to celebrate the publication of the new book that Morten and Amanda and I co-edited. It's, I've got it here. It's the, let me see if you can see it. Can you see it? I don't know. I think it doesn't show up the virtual background. I'll see if I can rectify that by the end. Anyway, it's a research handbook on human rights and poverty. It was published just a few weeks ago by Elgar Press as part of their research handbook series. And Martin said we conceived of this project well before the COVID-19 pandemic, but we were really in the midstream of writing and editing when the lockdown started. And it was people, of course, we've all been reminiscing for about a year ago, crazy time, and people will remember the level of uncertainty that there was. And our contributors forged ahead despite a lot of difficulties that they faced, some with illness and then just the uncertainty that we all had. So we're happy now to have the book, which I'll show you soon. You can see a little bit there, out into the world. The project began about 3 years ago, as Morten said, but it got a boost in 2019 when a number of the contributors were able to come together in Washington, D.C. for a panel at the annual Law and Society Association conference. And over time, the project grew to a book with 35 chapters from leading experts from around the world, including the speakers, the distinguished speakers at today's webinar. And then many of the contributors are also, I think, on the webinar as well. We really made an effort to cover a wide range of issues relating to poverty and human rights, which is, of course, already a pretty broad topic. Our limitation was that there was only a certain number of pages that could be bound together into a single book. And so we tried to include as much as possible within that one constraint that we had. The authors include activists like Alfred Brownell, writing on land rights in East Africa, as well as sort of activist academics like Philip Alston, who contributed a foreword, and Gay McDougall, who analyzed global responses to race, racism, and poverty. In some ways, I think the lockdowns and the slower pace that we all, had to put up with for a while contributed to the depth of the volume. So we have chapters from a number of former and current special rapporteurs. Leilani Fahra is here today, and will be speaking as one, of course. And I think that with travel on hold and many programs and events canceled, many of our contributors were able to step back a bit and take the time to reflect and synthesize their work in new ways. For example, Gerard Quinn, the current Special Rapporteur for Disability Rights, uses his chapter to map out a human rights and disability agenda for the 21st century. I'll mention now that, and we'll give you more information about this later, we're going to be holding a second webinar on May 18th, featuring 4 more contributors to the book: Jillian McNaughton, Magdalena Sepulveda Carmona, Natalia Angel Cabo. No, Natalia, you're on here now, no? Yeah, yes. Somebody else, and Domingo Rivera. You know who you are, the 4th person. The focus of that webinar will be inequality and poverty, and more to come on that. The idea behind the Research Handbook series that Elgar is putting out is not only to take stock and reflect, but also to lay out ideas for future research. And each of our contributors addressed this as well, offering research ideas in areas ranging from sexual identity and poverty. So Victor Madrigal-Borlos, the Special Rapporteur on sexual orientation and gender identity, presents a survey of his work, also addressing technology and taxation, labor law, and issues of privatization. And so our hope is that this book will not only provide a baseline that gathers and synthesizes current research, but that it will also be a resource for new researchers as they start grappling with the interactions and intersections between poverty and human rights. And with that, let me turn it back over to Morten to begin the discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Martha. Well, I think I'll take it from here. Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda, and it's really great to see so many people on the call today. And I think especially after all the time working on the book kind of over email and exchanging texts, it's really nice to have these spaces to have some conversations about all the exciting topics that are covered. So today I'm really glad to be able to introduce our panelists that we have speaking today. I'll just offer very brief, everybody has very extensive experience. I'll offer just a brief note on each of our speakers so you can have a sense of the depth of expertise that they bring to the conversation, and then we'll move into the remarks. So first online, we have Hansato Sano, who is research director at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and he's worked there for more than 20 years. He has a PhD in economic history and has worked with the World Bank previously, and has done research in several countries in Europe and in Africa also. And Hansato is really an expert and leader working at the nexus of development and poverty and human rights. And so we're really lucky to have him here, giving us kind of an overall look at what we mean by a human rights-based approach to poverty. So thanks for being here with us, Hansato. And next, we'll also be able to hear from Sumudu Adapatu, who is actually my neighbor over here next door in Wisconsin. And Sumudu is a lawyer trained in Sri Lanka and holds a PhD in international environmental law from Cambridge. Sumudu is the director of research centers and international programs at the University of Wisconsin Law School, and she's the executive director of the human rights program there. She also has the role of serving as lead counsel for human rights and poverty at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, which is a leading global research center. And so we're really pleased to be able to count on Sumudu's expertise, and today especially making the links with climate change. Next in the lineup, we have Leilani Fahra. Leilani is a lawyer by training and served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing from 2014 to 2020. So just recently having left that post. She's also the global director of The Shift, which is an international movement to secure the right to housing. And in both of those roles, Leilani has really been incredibly effective in developing the standards around the right to housing in several different areas, and especially on the financialization of housing, which was the focus of the chapter and some of the comments today. So we're really glad to have you, Leilani. And finally, joining us from Bogota, we have Natalia and Cabo. Natalia is a professor of law at the University de los Andes in Bogota, and she's the chief editor of the Latin American Law Review. Natalia has been Deputy Justice of the Colombian Constitutional Court. She's the founder and former director of the Action Program for Equality and Social Inclusion and has been a consultant on a wide range of human rights projects. In 2017, Natalia was nominated as a candidate to be a magistrate of the Colombian Constitutional Court and currently serves there as an associate justice. And Natalia today will be speaking about some of the social movements that have been taking place in Latin American cities, really based on economic social claims. So you can see we have a wide-ranging conversation today, and we will jump right into that. So first, our thought is to have a few remarks from our panelists on their different areas of expertise. You can feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat. If you would like to identify yourself, also please do that. And so after we have some of these remarks, we'll move into question and answer. And so I'd like to start with Hanzato, please. In your chapter, you make the strong point that declines in poverty are often kind of related in the literature to economic growth, tied really closely together, and that economists' interpretations don't always look at human rights. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about the human rights-based approach to poverty and what distinguishes it from other approaches.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I would like also, apart from addressing the issue and the question about the human rights-based approach to poverty, I would also like to take departure in some of the more recent trends and the recent patterns of change in Africa, which have come about due to the COVID-19, as Morten started by mentioning. Yeah, these changes are important, and not only for the negative, but also for the positive elements. But first, on this issue of addressing the linkages between human rights and poverty that you mentioned, and which where economists absolutely have failed to consider any elements of human rights, or they did that in the past. But also human rights scholars, I think they have not been, well, they have not paid much analytical attention to poverty, not in the African context, at least. I miss substantial work on the ground in the African context. But what I'm saying is that the consolidation of social security rights in the wake of the corona may change this pattern, because certainly now we see that social security rights have become very important elements in the wake of the corona. We have 40 countries in Africa who have introduced new cash transfer measures during 2020. And the numbers receiving social rights support have increased and amounts have risen. Urban food aid has also been a feature of COVID-19. So human rights elements have become important in the wake of the corona. And I think it will be difficult for African governments, and of course also for donors, to just forget about these new features of social rights protection. Poverty induced by COVID-19 is likely to be an urban one. Unemployment, youth, loss of jobs, massive negative impact on the informal sector. These are reasons why governments have been concerned about urban and youth unrest. And gender inequalities prevail in Africa. We have 40 countries worldwide which limit women's property rights, and the majority in Africa. While patterns of economic inequality vary in Africa, the impact of COVID-19 is likely to exacerbate gender inequality and female income opportunities. Violence against women has increased. In some countries, reports have raised concerns about systematic domestic violence. So, can you move to the next slide? Yes. Just to say a few words about what a human rights-based approach to poverty may imply. It means that poverty policies are based on human rights standards and principles, and the priorities of duty bearers in the poverty domain are settled in dialogue with poor people and their representations. Fundamental elements in that dialogue will circle around non-discrimination and will entail institutionalization of influence and empowerment from below. This means also that in the African context, the human rights-based approach can include inequality dimensions, for instance, urban-rural living standards, advocacy and empowerment, the rights-based change from below. Also, the metrics of poverty, rather than monetary metrics, support. We should think about support for non-monetary indicators, like done in the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. I think this is an important area where human rights has maybe influenced also the thinking in IFIs like the World Bank. Then we have social protections, as already mentioned, and also in the case of migrants. Freedoms, the democratic space, is a precondition for justice and empowerment. And finally, we have the climate and environmental impact. Okay, thank you very much. I'll end my brief here.
Hans-Otto, I'm going to take the prerogative of having the floor here to ask a quick follow-up question that is always a curiosity to me. I'm wondering, how important do you see it in your research or policy work that the human rights agenda have the name of human rights? Can you do kind of human rights work using these principles that you're listing out, or is it important to name explicitly that it's a human rights-based approach?
Not always. I don't think so. I mean, we're also today going to talk about the SDGs, and the linkages between the SDGs and the human rights are sometimes quite strong. At least you can use the SDGs also for promoting human rights. As regards social protection, we have the 1.3 SDG, the target 1.3, which is on social protection and which is formulated in human rights-based terms, but not mentioning human rights. SDGs are not mentioning human rights at all, except for one indicator.
That's a great example.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. I'm sure we'll be coming back to that point. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Hans-Otto. And let's move on to the next panelist, to Sumuto, and touching on where Hans-Otto landed sort of on the climate change, because one thing is what the COVID-19 crisis has brought about, but for sure the climate change also exacerbating poverty and also the conditions of vulnerability. We see both the sudden, the storms, the flooding, but also the long-term impact of the climate change in relation to sea level rising and other occurrences, and very often hitting disproportionately the most impoverished people in the communities. So Modu, can you describe a little bit this intersection between climate change, human rights, and poverty? I mean, how do you see you worked so much on that issue, and what do you think the human rights-based approach can contribute to address the situation, both in relation to the climate change, but definitely also in relation to the poverty eradication?
Thank you so much, Morten, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. So Morten, you touched on some of the consequences of climate change. Let me time myself. Like slow onset and sudden events. Sudden events we are very familiar with. There are so many severe weather events that are affecting, ranging from floods to hurricanes. And we also have slow onset events like sea level rise, desertification, and both are causing food and water shortages. And these have a direct impact on rights of people. And it's always the poor and the marginalized that are disproportionately affected by these consequences, whether it's poor countries in the world or poor people in rich countries as well. So it's a real injustice when we think about climate change. And COVID as well. We have seen that happening as well, the disproportionate impact on poor people and marginalized communities, minorities. There's a disproportionate impact on them, and they're least able to adapt to these consequences. As we know, 1.3 billion people currently live in multidimensional poverty. Which means that it's not just about income we are talking about, but poor people have multiple other disadvantages. And climate change, like with COVID, will exacerbate poverty and other conditions of vulnerability. And the World Bank has estimated that climate change will push 120 million more people into poverty by 2030. And as we know, poverty is also a human rights issue because poor people cannot really enjoy their rights, or they are also at a greater risk of having their rights infringed. Like with climate change, poverty and environmental issues, like Hans mentioned just now, are also interrelated. Poor people tend to live in areas where the environment is degraded, or they are vulnerable to these environmental consequences, and environmental treaties and instruments have recognized this linkage, starting with our Common Future report. And as we saw with the consequences of climate change, there's a direct impact on human rights. So the enjoyment of many of the rights that are protected under international human rights law could be undermined because of the consequences of climate change. So climate change will exacerbate poverty. Both climate change and poverty have human rights implications. They're all interlinked. Morten, you asked me why a human rights approach is important. I think it gives a human face to the problem. We tend to talk about both climate change and poverty sort of at the macro level in abstract terms. But these are real people who are being affected by both these issues, right? So giving a human face to the problem is important. And it also gives victims a voice. We know that in many of these negotiations that take place at the international level, often these vulnerable groups are not heard. They are not given a voice. They are not represented. So by adopting a human rights approach, we can give them a voice, not just in relation to negotiations, but if they can get to the courts, they can seek a remedy. Of course, there are other jurisdictional and other hurdles to overcome, but the human rights framework provides them with a remedy. And also, the framework principles on human rights and environment have highlighted that states have additional obligations to ensure that the rights of vulnerable people are protected. So that in addition to the human rights obligations that states have in relation to everybody else, states will have additional obligations. To sort of sum up, poverty, human rights, and climate change are interlinked. Both are human rights, both climate change and poverty are human rights issues. They are global issues with localized consequences, and both can undermine people's ability to enjoy rights. And the other issue that I want to highlight is that these vulnerabilities intersect with one another. So it's important to recognize this intersectional nature of climate change, poverty, and human rights, and they have to be addressed together. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sumudu. And I was just wondering, I mean, would you also see human rights and the SDG as sort of as an analytical tool to identify, in particular, when you have a suddenly occurring crisis, who are those groups that are left behind? Where is it that we should step in? Groups that may be overlooked today, that the human rights and the SDGs can sort of have played that role as well. Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the SDGs, you know, if you're a poor person, right? Many of the SDGs will be violated, like access to water, for example, gender equality, access to education. So, SDGs highlight the intersectional nature of these goals, and human rights provides us with a tool to bring to light the impact on vulnerable communities. And I mentioned the injustice of climate change earlier, and the justice framework, in addition to SDGs and human rights, I think the justice framework is a really good tool. Environmental justice is a really good tool to highlight the disproportionate impact on some of these communities. And the human rights gives them a tool to, you know, bring their issues to the table and things like that. So there are several sort of frameworks that we can use to highlight the disproportionate impact on some of these communities.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Sumudu. That's great. And of course, related to a lot of environmental justice and climate change questions is the right to housing. Leilani, we'll turn to you. And in your chapter with Caitlin Schwan, you really convey really compelling the levels of challenges in housing and how intractable those are. And I think also how core that is to human dignity and the experience of people that are living in poverty. So I'm hoping you'll tell us a little bit about how you see the human rights-based approach to housing and poverty. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. And I just want to thank, in particular, Martha and Morten for inviting me into this whole project, and my colleague Caitlin, and for being so incredibly patient with us as we missed every single deadline all along the way. Thank you. It's a real a pleasure to be here, and certainly an honor. I want to start by saying this. I think two things are certain and have been exposed dramatically during the pandemic. First, that governments have failed to effectively implement the right to housing, all the way up to the pandemic and well through the pandemic. And we know this because if the right to housing had been taken seriously and integrated into legislative and policy making, we would not see widespread homelessness, including for particular groups of people, which is a prima facie violation. We would not see the rise of informal settlements without basic services like water and sanitation, which constitutes a violation of the right to housing. We would not see the world's urban population living in unaffordable rental housing, fearful of and subject to eviction, a violation of human rights. We would not see people being forcibly evicted into homelessness, a violation of human rights. And we would not see governments facilitating high finance so that it can mine housing and home of its value. And the second thing that I am certain of is that governments have not been held accountable for the misery and inequality they have created through their unswerving commitment to a neoliberal agenda, which has played itself out acutely in the area of housing and residential real estate. And I want to be clear that governments haven't just allowed the financialization of housing to happen unregulated. They haven't just supported it through law and policy. And they haven't just granted high finance, undue political advantage and persuasion. They have, in fact, based their entire economies and governance structures in the financialization of housing. So in the face of all of this, what does a rights-based approach offer? I have 5 points. First, homelessness, living under bridges on the pavements, eviction and forced eviction from your home, from your lands, from your culture, grossly inadequate housing, lacking basic services. All of these phenomenon challenge dignity, challenge well-being, and challenge human life itself. These are human rights matters and therefore demand human rights responses. So, I mean, it would be unthinkable that we would treat other human rights matters in a way that didn't have a human rights response. We need to start doing that with respect to housing, and that in and of itself is a value added. I think human rights change tenants, dwellers, residents from beneficiaries of charity at best or criminals at worst into rights holders. So when a community is formed along a railway because they have nowhere else to live, or a tent is pitched on a sidewalk, through human rights, we see these and understand these as rights claims by human rights defenders. And that changes then policy and legislative talk and action. Officials, government officials suddenly become responsible for implementing human rights. That becomes their chief role. Third, human rights require the meaningful participation of communities in decisions that affect their lives. And I mean, frankly, this just makes for better decision-making, and it makes for more peaceful and happy societies. That may sound charming, but I think it's true. If you look around the world at all the protests, all the people taking to the streets prior to the pandemic in particular, but even during the pandemic, so much of that is based in the fact that people are not being listened to by their governments, including about their housing conditions. Human rights-based housing strategies include accountability mechanisms. It's a requirement of a human rights-based housing strategy. And that to me is one of the real strengths. There are standards that attach to the right to housing that governments must meet. Every housing and finance decision taken should come under human rights analysis. how does it move forward the right to housing of marginalized populations? And there must be venues, as the previous speaker said, for rights holders to go where they can hold their governments accountable. And in fact, just show governments what is required in order for them to enjoy their human rights. And lastly, I'll say that I think the human rights framework, and it's a framework that actually does inform the SDGs, is quite unique for having as its central goal the pursuit of equality. We have seen starkly through COVID just how unequal the world really is. I read in Forbes magazine recently, in the last year, we have seen a new billionaire created every 17 hours, 500 new billionaires during the pandemic. At the same time, the World Bank anticipates an additional 150 million people will be living in extreme poverty, newly living in extreme poverty. The implementation of human rights across sectors and through human rights-based legislation and policy is the correction to inequality. A lot of people are talking right now about the new social contract, a new social contract. And I like those discussions, but any new social contract would have to be based in human rights. Thank you.
Leilani, that's so helpful to break it out like that. I'm wondering if you could say just a word in your experience. Are you seeing the SDG agenda as something that's opening the way for advancing that type of a human rights-based approach? Or how are you seeing the SDGs in that space?
No. One thing that's really interesting is local governments that I'm working with are really apprised of the SDGs, and they are taking the SDGs quite seriously. But the very worrying thing that we all know about the pursuit of the SDGs, especially now with this depression, economic depression and recession that we're in, is that private capital is going to be required. That's what governments are saying. Private capital is going to be required in order to actually meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 or thereafter. And in the housing sector, that's a complete disaster. I mean, that's the body of work I've been dealing with, which is private equity, pension funds, private monies invading the housing landscape, having no regard for human rights and the human right to housing, and really putting so much pressure on on housing systems that really ending up in many multiple violations of the right to housing. So I am very disturbed by the way the SDGs are being approached, and this sort of natural inclination to look for private money to make it happen. Governments claim they're poor. The one thing the pandemic has shown is that governments can print money. They're printing money. They're just printing money, and so we need some pushback. I just will say one more thing. I noticed that President Biden, in his infrastructure bill, has said that he will not extend monies to private equity to help with the building of infrastructure in the United States, which includes housing and housing supports. And people are critiquing him. Oh, that's a 1970s and 1980s style of infrastructure. But I completely admire it. I think he's right to say governments can do infrastructure, and we will do infrastructure without private equity. It's a good sign.
Thank you very much, Leilani, and you are excused for being a little bit late with the with some of the submissions. So no, thanks a lot. It was such a great piece, and also thanks a lot for your presentation now. And now over to Natalia, and actually the question to you is also, let's say, responding to a question from one in our audience who also would like to hear about the sort of the social movements. How do we engage people in the struggle against poverty? And what you write in your article that you have co-authored with Professor Luisa Sotomayor of York University, You start out looking at the social unrest in Chile in 2018, which I also share with you is a unique, let's say, example of how a social unrest use the human rights language, and they focused very much and focus still very much on the constitution in Chile. So I think it's interesting now to see that the social mobilization is partly bringing on board, I would almost say again, a human rights language. So my question to you is that what is the future? How do you see the development of the social mobilization, and how does the human rights movement play into them? Or is this new sort of social mobilization, as we have seen in Chile, is that the future human rights movement? Question mark. Of course, focusing very much on economic, social, and cultural rights.
Well, first, thank you, Morten, Martha, Amanda, for this, for the edition of this wonderful book. I'm really, really honored to be a part of it and a part of this webinar. I will answer your question by first explaining in which context we were addressing the Chilean protests and others. Our chapter basically reflects on the potential of human rights for social change and poverty reduction from the perspective of the city. Hans Soto was really saying now poverty is also is nowadays an urban phenomenon mostly. And so one of the things that we address, or we were showing, is that in the last years, there has an emergence of critique of rights. Critique of rights have been for many years around, but in the last 10 days, we've seen with full force these critiques. You've seen several books coming out criticizing the potential of rights for social change and really casting doubts about the potential of rights. You could see Samuel Moyn's book, Posner, Hubgood. There's plenty of books really, really making strong critiques on the potential of rights to challenge equality and poverty. And definitely these critiques have some purchase. As for instance, if we take into Moyn's concern, well, it is true, equality has not been eradicated from the world. And for that instance, poverty neither. But what we are trying to say in our paper, and we are far from optimists, is that doesn't mean that there are some potential for human rights and for human rights to produce social change. And one of the biggest examples that we think is important is that human rights have been for many, many years a common language for social movements to raise their grievance and to challenge injustice and inequality. And in that instance, we show and take into account the protests that took place not only in Chile, as a matter of fact, in many, many cities of the world, and in Latin America was particularly relevant, using the language of rights. I don't know if I will show you one PowerPoint, but if you can see this PowerPoint, this is a PowerPoint of social protests taking place in Latin America, in Colombia. One is from Colombia, another is from Chile, from La Paz, and from Mexico. And this, of course, I didn't take photos of everything, but you can see they are really using the language of right. It was a protest about claiming the right to health, the right to food, the right to education, the right to social security. So I don't think it's a minor contribution of human rights basically to provide that language of rights. Whether this is a new thing, of course not. Social movements have used rights and challenged for rights and mobilized to defend rights for centuries and for many, many, many years. But it's interesting how, at least in this protest, in which we brought the example, how it was really, really a powerful tool for social movements. Of course, social movements use creative ways of how to challenge privilege and injustice, and this is one of them. What is to follow? Well, I think we also need to understand what is happening now. The question with COVID and social movement is an interesting one, because one of the impacts of COVID has been on mobilization and social movement, especially for the poor. So the poor, basically the way to mobilize and to have collective actions is to take out the streets. And so I've seen one article that says that there was a decrease between 2019, when we saw all these protests, and 2020, of course, in social protests outside the streets. I don't remember who the author was, but he was claiming that it was around 60%. But you've seen some other creative ways in which people are mobilizing, but for sure we have to ask what will go for social movements and for social protest and mobilization around rights with these new circumstances. Because you would see, for example, also governments that, in the name of protecting health and protecting security, also restricting fundamental rights as to mobilize in order to advocate for rights. So yeah, we'll have to discuss it in the context of COVID.
Thank you very much. You raised sort of or you mentioned the critique of Moyne and Hopgood and others. I mean, their critique is basically leading to a complete dismissal of the human rights, let's say, regime, or sort of the whole thinking in terms of human rights. I was wondering, from what you said now, and if would you see it in the way that they have actually overlooked what happened in the global south, that their critique is very much linked to what happened in the global north and the big American British organization Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and that was it, basically ignoring what they sort of say they critique. I mean, I think that is also what an author like Catherine Sicking is sort of in her book, and also taking outset in Latin America. How would you see this?
Well, actually, one critique that was made to Moyne book, but not enough, was that it was too Americanized reading of human rights and European reading of human rights, and he really responded denying, really saying, no, I did take into account the global south. I'm really not sure that he was not reading it from a very Americanized and European perspective. And I think the responses, there are several responses to those critiques, showing how in the global south we have had a very interesting, let's say, gains, for example, with respect to socioeconomic rights, litigation, and enforcement. And those things cannot be dismissed. Those have been important gains for social rights. And even the fact that we're talking about, we have not achieved complete housing or education, but we have had several gains, I think, since the late 80s. That cannot be dismissed. And so I do think there's a hold on that critique against the critics of the human rights regime. They would never say that they are dismissing altogether the human rights, but they basically are really making very strong claims. Sometimes, especially with the equality, I think you are asking too much for human rights. I don't think human rights will just bring equality, eradicate poverty, but that doesn't mean they are limited, but that doesn't mean they do not have potential to help and aid to produce social change. So, yes.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And that sort of exhausts our brilliant panel, and that has definitely provoked a lot of very good comments and questions. Not that I have at all a chance to read it all, and but I just sort of can feel it when it passes over the screen. But before we open up for some of the questions, I just wonder if any of the panelists would have some comments or questions to some of the other panelists, or something you would like to deepen in light of what had been said. And also you, Martha, if you have something you would like to add, comment on. You
Well,
just, I can see you also. Martha?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been working, working with some of the voluntary local reviews that communities are doing. There are only 3 of them that have been done in the U.S., but I've been taking a look at them. And what struck me is that you know, the reports certainly go through the SDGs and you know, sort of identify the metrics, but there's not any recognition in those reports, you know, explicitly of a human rights base. And it's also the case that there hasn't really been community participation, which is one thing that I would hope that the SDGs, you know, the SDG framework would open up at the community level. And so I wondered, I mean, Leilani, you talked about working with communities, I guess, maybe around the world, but maybe in Canada, around SDGs. Just wonder, to what extent do you think they really have the capacity to be the basis for organizing or increasing participation at the local level in, you know, changing frameworks and challenging sort of local goals?
I mean, I think cities have a tremendous role to play and tremendous capacity. I think there's a couple things at play there, though. On the one hand, cities need to recognize the potential role they have and the potential capacity they have. Cities are quite quick to say that they don't have enough resources and that they don't have the competencies to do things to move us toward the sustainable development goals, if that's the goal, or to implement the human rights. That's often not the case. And so cities need to kind of sit with themselves a little bit and look and push the boundaries of what's possible. And I mean, there are some real leaders out there. You look at Mayor Ada Colau in Barcelona, even the mayor of Berlin doing really some very interesting things. The mayor of Montreal, formerly the mayor of Seoul, you know, really trying some different human rights oriented things and pushing boundaries. I think there also, city governments need to own up to the role they play in abusing human rights, certainly in the housing sector. I mean, I know there are people on this call with more expertise on this than me, but if you look at who's implementing forced evictions, it's often city level government. If you look at who's sweeping up homeless people from under bridges, from parks, et cetera, it's often city level government. So they need to do some little soul searching there too. They could do so much better. But then national level governments really do need to look at what they've downloaded to cities and recognize that cities really are on the front line of all of these crises, whether it's the climate crisis or the global housing crisis, and ensure that cities have the resources and capacities to move forward this agenda. So a little bit of a mixed response there, Martha.
Very good. Sumulu?
I have a comment and a question. The comment is about lack of money, and I think it was Leilani who mentioned that, you know, governments claim that they don't have enough money. And I would like to say that, sure, I mean, they have enough money to spend on, say, national security. When it comes to security, they always have money. But when it comes to environmental issues or human rights issues, or even poverty, they don't have enough money. I mean, if we can even take a fraction of the money governments spend on security, there will be enough money for many of the projects that we are talking about. The question I have, I think the only economist in the panel is Hans, is about the current economic system that has led to these inequalities and climate change as well. It's an externality of our economic system. So we are trying to fix a problem or problems that have been caused by the system by relying on the same system that caused them. So, I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense at all. So how do we address this, both poverty and climate change? I don't think we have succeeded in addressing these issues by relying on the same economic system that caused them. So any sort of advice that you can provide to us would be very welcome.
Before you reply, Hans Otto, I will add one or two questions along the same line from the audience, because it is an issue that is definitely figuring quite a bit in the chat. We have Milun Kotari, who is also an author in the book. Very pleased that you're here as well. And he basically asked if the entire SDGs is flawed in the sense that they build on exactly the economy that has led to some of these challenges that we are. Milun is also asking another question that also to you, Hans Otto, and that is you focus, and others have as well, focused on the urban areas, where he said it's what about the rural areas, where we definitely see the poverty. Sumudu already addressed it somewhat in your presentation, but I think there's a big basket of questions here in relation to the neoliberal economy. Hans Otto?
Yes, just to Sumudu's question on the system and the system's the ability to reform the system and to use the system in order to redress, for instance, the threats of climate change. This is a small question, a very detailed one, and not, I think it's not easy to answer because it's so, it takes into account one understanding of the system. You could say that the system is neoliberal, like Morten just said, and that is true. It's also authoritarian in some ways if you move from the west to the east, and there are systems and systems within the global sphere, and if we have to address the issues from a scientific point of view, from an analytical point of view, I think we need to dig into to these distinctions and to understand better the social forces behind. Also, when we talk about the SDGs, we could think like Milun is arguing that the SDGs is just not the answer. You could also counterpose it with some of the experiences of the Millennium Development Goals and some of the ability of the Millennium Goal, at least to create some changes in health and education, despite a lot of the deficits in the Millennium Development Goal. And it's not that I'm an advocate of the Millennium Development Goals. I'm perhaps more happy with the Sustainable Development Goals, But still, I also recognize, for instance, on climate change, the indicators of climate change in the Sustainable Development Goals are not very impressive in my view. So there's also a question of how we use the Sustainable Development Goals, how they are used by social actors. You can, in a way, you can play with them, you can translate them, and you can use them as a way also to create a movements against the prevailing rulers in various places. So there are many complicated issues here, and there are many opportunities, but there are also many threats. And so I think we need to dig into these issues from a more detailed point of view in order to provide a very good answer. On Milon's question on the urban issues, I just want to say that I mentioned in urban Africa that poverty was emerging or was gaining ground there. I'm not saying it's the only impact, it's also reaching rural areas in Africa, certainly, but due to the impact of the COVID-19, mainly in urban areas in Africa, it's here that I see some of the difficult issues.
Thank you, Hans Otto. And I can say that together with the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute is working now, or initiating a project with a number of heterodox economists to, exactly as panelists have said, dig much deeper into to this issue and how we see the interconnectedness, and also to offer, let's say, try to offer some new avenues when it comes to the way we perceive the economy. Amanda.
Sure, thanks. And I'm just realizing that we had questions in the Q&A and in the chat, so there's a lot of great comments, so we can come back to those. Just two to kind of throw out to any panelists that might be interested in answering this. One question is about specifically about migrants and people with undocumented status, if that's something that you're seeing in your work. And a question that I have is, how are you seeing human rights institutions, whether at the national level or in international or regional systems, playing? What role are they taking in these? So I'll leave that open to anybody that has a comment. Natalia, you look unmuted. Can I throw it to you?
I look unmuted. Okay. No, perhaps I can say something about migrants, and especially I am here in Colombia, and as you can see, we're really facing a very difficult crisis with Venezuelan migrants in Colombia, which is really, really, if you're here, you could see that this is not a joke. It's really, really tough. But I will address something that we say in the paper regarding both our questions about the SDGs and cities in general with respect to migrants. Is that our concern is that in many of these discussions that place cities as the preferred site for the implementation of SDGs and for the implementation of human rights, we are kind of concerned that people are really looking at cities as if they were a territorial fix and not something that is relational and complex, and where there's a lot of informal, spontaneous, radical forms of political action and of dilemmas. So just recognizing that this is more complex than just something that you implement and that's it, and that you will have to understand these difficulties that are even in the concept of cities is important. And that means also recognizing the amount of informal, of migrants, of irregular migrants that are nowadays in the cities that they need to participate and appropriate the benefits of the city. And that's also a place, and I'm thinking in my context, in the case of Venezuelans, that for some time they were denied even the recognition of fundamental as right holders in one particular territory. So I think the question of migrants brings into attention the challenges of implementing formal rights in complex settings that are not formal and fixed jurisdictions, but relational sites, which is important. I don't know if that makes sense at all, but.
Great, thanks, Natalia. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that.
Leilani.
Sure. If I can, I'll address a few things that have come up, and then I want to raise something as well, maybe for Sumudu, but maybe for others as well. So I just wanted to talk about the SDGs and Maloon's comment, which I really thoroughly appreciated. And I mean, you're sitting in the midst of this pandemic, and I'll speak quite casually, sitting here, and it's just going on, and things start. For me, in my head, it's like the relevance of things have changed so much. To me, everything needs to be reevaluated. And I would agree with Maloon, maybe the entire framing of the SDGs doesn't even apply right now. But then to go to what Hans Otto said, there is a way in which, and this is something I love about law generally, maybe I'm an egghead, but we can interpret things. Like when the SDGs were presented to me, I'm the UN rapporteur, I had to, in my former life, I had to grapple with them. Well, they seemed so mild, and as I said, so many governments were treating them in a kind of neoliberal way, as Maloon has pointed out. And so I decided, well, I'm just going to take it and interpret it to based on what I know is correct under international human rights law. And so I took target 11.1 of goal 11, and I said that it means all states must end homelessness by 2030, that there was no other reasonable interpretation of that target, because it says everyone should have adequate, affordable, secure housing by 2030. So to me, that means the only interpretation is that homelessness must be ended. And I mean, that's very consistent with human rights, because of course, homelessness is a prima facie violation. So I do think that if we're stuck with these things, we can do that kind of radical reinterpretation that I think Maloon is calling for, and that I support. On the migrants issue, I developed at the very end of my mandate a set of guidelines for the implementation of the right to housing, and I did have to grapple with the issue of how migrants, undocumented and documented, are dealt with in terms of housing. They live in some of the worst conditions, period. And many states adopt a position of, well, if I'm going to implement the right to housing, I'm going to do it for my own people, not for people who aren't even from my own country. That's a very common non-universal application of the human right to housing. And so obviously that's contrary to international human rights and humanitarian law. And so I tried to develop some provisions in those guidelines. I can put the URL up in the chat to address that discriminatory, deeply discriminatory treatment of migrants and refugees in terms of housing. I wanted to comment on national human rights institutions. I have a close working relationship for a long time, before a rapporteur, as rapporteur, and now post-rapporteur with NHRIs. I think that they can, should, and must play a really important role, both in terms of accountability and monitoring of human rights and their implementation, as well as acting as a really nice kind of swing between grassroots movements, community organizations, NGOs, and government. They can play a really important facilitative role. Now, that's if they are NHRIs that meet the Paris principles and are independent and not just an arm of the state. And the last thing I want to say, I'm sorry, I'm taking up too much airtime, I know, but this is really important because I want Sumudu to weigh in on this, if not now, then in a future conversation, Sumudu. One of the things, I mean, obviously we all care very deeply about climate change and the climate crisis. And we know that it is disproportionately affecting Indigenous peoples and peoples living in poverty, as Sumudu has so eloquently articulated for us. One of the things that isn't being talked about enough, I don't think, is that when states undertake climate mitigation strategies, they are often violating the human rights of those same groups. So, you know, I go to Jakarta and I see this new wall, seawall that's being put up to, you know, keep away the tsunami, and the seawall is going to completely evict a community. I'm quite concerned about what's happening in Europe with the green wave, the renovation wave, the renovation wave that Frans Timmermans, the executive vice president of the European Union Commission, is heading and talking about. You know, if we get owners of buildings, apartment buildings, to make their buildings more green so that they're more energy efficient and therefore more affordable in some ways for people, that could also result in displacement. And I've heard lots of developers saying things like, oh, you want me to do a green building? Well, that's expensive, so I'm not going to be able to have affordable units in those buildings because it's just too expensive for me to create a green building. So I'm obviously we have to address the climate crisis on the one hand, but we have to do it in a way that recognizes that in so doing, we could be violating, let's say, the right to housing for people living in poverty and Indigenous peoples. Okay, stopping.
Morten, do you want me to quickly address that?
That would be good. Very shortly, we are running desperately out of time, and we would like to have just a short summing up from Martha. So yes, please do, Sumudu.
Sure. Leilani, that's a great point. And I would just say that I have a chapter in my book on human rights approaches to climate change on mitigation and adaptation and the need to apply a human rights framework. So I'll stop there.
Very good. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, this brings us towards the end. We have 2 minutes left. So Martha, if you would, now you lost the backdrop, but that's fine. If you would sort of say some of the main takeaway from this, and Martha.
Yes, thanks. So I deliberately lost the backdrop so that I could show.
Very good.
Okay, so here it is. It actually exists, and hopefully folks will have a chance to dip into it. We've gotten a flavor here today of some of the really rich contributions that our contributors made. So quickly, you know, a few highlights for me. You know, people have identified the fact that government's shortcomings and failures have been exposed even more dramatically through COVID-19, through the crisis. Particularly talking about the right to housing, but also in other areas. At the same time, as Hans Otto pointed out, that the impact may also be to create an opening for the rise of attention to human rights as governments are looking for ways to try to, you know, address some of these issues. Sumudu talked about the way in which a human rights approach can give a human face and a voice to individuals who are affected by these violations, and particularly thinking about climate change. And then finally, the idea that human rights, of course, is not a panacea, but has the potential to produce social change in an urban context that Natalia talked about. At the same time, you know, we see that there are limits to what human rights can achieve, but the language of human rights is very durable and shows up in all sorts of places where people are mobilized and active and speaking truth to power. So we're left with a lot of open questions that we weren't able to address in the chat, but we're going to be continuing the dialogue on May 18th with a new set of speakers. And I want to thank everyone for coming today, and especially our speakers for their you know, really tremendous contributions.
Thank you very much, Martha. And if you look at the front page, if you can have it up just once more, and you wonder what is that, then it is a map of London highlighting the poor areas. It's basically a poverty map from, I think, the end of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century. So it's really have a closer look at that map. It's really fantastic. We couldn't resist that one for this book. Anyhow, thanks a lot to all the panelists, and thanks a lot for all the comments in the chat. Extremely valuable, and we will save the chat and see if we can bring it in the future discussions. And some of it we may also send you some direct replies. At least I saw some that could need that. So I don't know, Amanda, any?
Thank you, and greetings to everybody from Minneapolis, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Leilani.